We appreciate all of you here today. We're hoping that this is going to be an interactive dialogue. Please feel free to ask any questions during the course of my presentation or the other presentations that I give later on in the day. We're also hoping that in the space that you're in today is that you're going to make a friend just like you did on the first day in kindergarten, right? And that there are a lot of great ideas and that you're going to build on that momentum, and that the ideas that are going on in southeast Minnesota are going to plant a seed in northwest Minnesota or vice versa. You might have situations in which Duluth maybe is providing something in northeast Minnesota down in southwest Minnesota, down in Walnut Grove, for example. So with that, let me start by giving you a little bit of a background for some of those of you who are unaware of what the Department of Human Rights does. And we're also again, within this space, please feel free to ask any questions during the course of it. I know for some of you, this will be familiar information. For others of you, this may be the first time in which you are hearing it. So our mission is pretty straightforward. It is to make Minnesota discrimination-free. And it is the 50th year of the Department of Human Rights being a cabinet-level agency. That is relatively unique. When you take a look across the country, very few states actually have a statewide human rights agency. And of those states, very few actually have the state being incorporated within the governor's cabinet. One of the things which is unique about the Minnesota Human Rights Act, as opposed to the statutes that govern the creation formation of the other administrative agencies that comprise the governor's cabinet, is that the Commissioner of Human Rights can call upon and obtain information from any and all cabinet-level agencies. And if you stop and think about it as it relates to being able to address, eliminate discrimination, disparate outcomes, to the extent that we're talking about public services, we're talking about public accommodations, it probably would be important for such an agency such as ours to be able to call upon, obtain assistance from all the other administrative agencies. Within the Minnesota Human Rights Act itself, and it can be found in 363 for those of you who are late at night and you want to go through your Minnesota statutes, you will find that there are actually 19 duties which are identified within 363A36 for the department to give, or the commissioner to give, his or her attention to. But there are 3 primary duties which are lifted up within those 19. The first is to investigate charges of discrimination. The second is to ensure equal employment opportunity exists on state contracts. And the third is to use education conference conciliation or education to reduce discrimination and disparate outcomes. Now, I want to stop and say this to you. You do not have to be an attorney to be the Commissioner of the Department of Human Rights. Even though the Commissioner of Human Rights, when they issue a statement in which a Minnesota Supreme Court or Minnesota Court of Appeals has not addressed that issue concerning the interpretation of the Act, it actually becomes the legal position of the state of Minnesota. Now, I have been practicing law since 1991, but it is not the case that you have to be an attorney. So I do take with great fidelity sort of responsibility is that if there has been an absence or there is a void as it relates to an interpretation concerning the Act, how would I look at it as it relates to if I was a member of the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court and giving an interpretation for the Act? And then as it relates to administrative rules which help and guide, we also adhere to that principle as well. Within the Human Rights Act, it identifies very broadly several subject matter areas for the department to be mindful of combating and addressing discrimination. So we have employment, housing, real property, public accommodations, public services, and education. So to give you a little bit of an example as it relates to what that would look like from an analogous standpoint at the federal level. We have some members of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the room here, so to the extent a federal administrative agency with responsibility, that would be the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. In the area of housing, that would primarily be the investigators within housing and urban development. Public accommodations, public services, that's going to be attorneys within the Department of Justice. In education, there are attorneys within the Department of Education that are partnered, Department of Justice within the Office of Civil Rights within Education that would be responsible for enforcing those analogous provisions under federal law. Now, for some of you in the room, you have probably followed that our U.S. Attorney is not a big a proponent as it relates to providing oversight in the area of education, and there's a question as it relates to whether that area will be fully staffed. But in the other respective areas, that continues to be staffed at the federal level. Well, why is that important that I share that with you? Minnesota's Supreme Courts have often relied upon the interpretation of federal law to sort of guide the interpretation of Minnesota law, to guide it, but they're not dictated by it. And that doesn't mean that they will always align perfectly as relates to federal law. But we need to be mindful, and we do partner with those federal agencies in ensuring and understanding sort of where the law is. A quick example of sort of how it is different. It has been the case in the under Minnesota law that individuals have been protected who are LGBTQ in employment since '91 within the state of Minnesota. And some federal circuits, there is an open conversation as it relates to whether individuals who identify as LGBTQ would be protected, just to give you an example as it relates to the differences. Over the past 6 years, we have processed 81 cases, or we've processed cases in 81 of the 87 counties. Anyone know where Kitson is? Couple people? Okay. So very tip, northwest tip of the state. There are a couple of spots within the state of Minnesota which we have not had a charge. This is not something that I generally walk around with this knowledge, but having worked on absentee ballots and getting to know the different ways in which counties cast ballots. In Kitson, there's less than, I think it's 4,461 people or something like that within the county. It's a pretty small number. They actually cast their ballots by mail. They actually don't have a polling spot. So there's a strong correlation between the counties that have very few people and the ones that we don't have a charge within. The first 5 years, we completed more than 2,700 investigations from a historical basis for individuals within the room. The 4 years prior to becoming commissioner, the department had investigated 1,080 cases. So this is relatively significant, and a lot of kudos to the staff for putting the proverbial shoulder to the wheel and being able to up the number of investigations in which they've been able to complete. Employment, we typically have the largest number of sort of employment cases within our mix. Somewhere between 55 and 70% of the cases in the inventory of the department are employment cases at any one point in time. The most common type of employment case that we have in the department is disability. And it's generally followed, depending on when you ask me the question, of either race, age, or gender. I gave you the number as it relates to the production, but it's also important to keep in mind as it relates to the average length of time to investigate cases. So that has dropped by 187 days by the department. So the efficiency as it relates to the overall number of cases, but then also the timeliness. And as someone who has had some experience trying cases, appreciating the fact that when individuals come to the department, there has been some appreciable amount of time. The fact that we take additional time in investigating cases may have a negative impact on the ability of an individual with a probable cause determination to be able to get some measure of justice if it has to go to court. Most of the cases in which we investigate in the area do not actually end up in court or before the Office of Administrative Hearing. About 97 to 98% of the cases in which we find a probable cause or make a determination of probable cause for discrimination gets settled. We do have cases, however, that occasionally do get into district court and before the Office of Administrative Hearing. I feel very fortunate not to actually have had one go all the way to the distance of trial yet. All of those that have been filed in district court or before the Office of Administrative Hearing have actually settled. Only one, I think, got to the point of actually having to take a deposition or two. And I think that was probably because there was a recalibration or recalculation of the risk to the other side of going forward. So again, kudos to a lot of the staff. I see Peter, the general counsel for the department, in the back of the room. And I know that there's probably some other enforcement officers too. A lot of good work is being done by them. St. Cloud, historically for the Department of Human Rights, the city of St. Cloud partnered with us several years ago. They were able to secure some funding from the federal government through a HUD grant, and they partnered with the Department of Human Rights to initiate having a St. Cloud office. The mayor and I had been talking off and on for the last 4 to 5 years. Surprisingly, he wanted me to find money within the Minnesota legislature as opposed to him having to find money to operate. Probably not surprising. So we went back and forth, had good conversations with folks within the legislature. We were able to secure a small measure of money for the St. Cloud office, and we're very happy to be able to say we have some funding to support the St. Cloud office. The last legislative session, there was a proposal to expand the scope and number of offices for the Department of Human Rights. So we were looking to add offices in Rochester, Worthington, Duluth, and then also add additional resources in St. Cloud. Had we been successful, that probably would have added somewhere between 8 to 10 individuals to the department. And again, talking about the number of counties, remember how big and large the scope of the state of Minnesota is. That really would have been helpful. And for us, what we were saying is that no Minnesotan would have been more than 2 hours away from one of our offices had we been able to get the 4 satellite offices. Let me say one thing about the size of government and the size of the department. Had we gotten the funding for that, we would have 5 fewer people than the department had in 1996. So let me say it again. 5 fewer had we received this additional funding for additional people. So again, the department is doing tremendous, I consider the staff of the department doing great work given the number of people that are within the department. One of the things that we have been engaged in a conversation with, and this really surrounds some of the work which we're trying to do in the space of ensuring equal employment opportunities exist among all state contractors, is ensuring that people sort of understand the dynamic at play as it relates to the workforce challenges going forward. And my humble opinion, sometimes which gets lost within the conversation of work the department does and other departments across the country, is that we're kind of locked into a conversation that we had in the 70s or 80s, where Bill has to lose a job, who identifies as a white male, so Kevin can have an opportunity to take that job. Yeah, I thought there would be a few amens in the crowd. So to that extent, sometimes the way we preface this conversation is just to ensure to people that if you take a look at the individuals between 15 and 65 today, and our total population, that would represent about 63% of the total population. In 15 years, that number shrinks down to 57%. So for the folks in HR, you kind of knew that, but it still made you a little queasy, right? Because it's difficult now to think about recruiting and retention. So this is not really a conversation, again, 20 or 30 years, when we had a population between 15 and 64, which was around 70%. And not that we weren't good in HR, but you didn't have to be as good as you're going to be, right? So to that extent, this really is an opportunity for us all to come together and work collaboratively to make sure that every child succeeds and they're able to fulfill whatever dream of whatever job that they would like. This really is incumbent upon us as a society to make sure that every child wins. So for us, when we're asking questions and talking about this change, I know some people will hear us talking about a doubling of the number of people of color within the 7-county metro, but I want you to also keep in mind as it relates to that overall demographic number of what I'm talking about, of the number of people shrinking in that workforce group between 15 and 65. And again, it's not to say that we won't have people working past 65, because we will. But that's still a significant number. Let me say one thing before I advance the slide. This 85 counties will experience an increase in people of color. When we adjusted the workforce goals, one of the facts that I shared with groups to sort of illustrate that point, the number of children in K-12 education outside the 7-county metro, 19% children of color. So this conversation as it relates to, is it just happening in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or is it just happening in the 7 counties? I appreciate the fact that today, 1 in 5 children outside the 7-county metro that are in a K-12 school identify as a child of color. Within the work that we're doing within contract compliance, we're spending a lot of time trying to work with educational institutions, such as that we're in here, the University of Minnesota, the MNSCU, unions, sitting down with community groups to make sure that things are wired together and that people know how to leverage opportunities for creating career pathways for individuals who are interested in finding the jobs, careers of their dreams. Now, we're doing this across the board. I've talked a little bit about race. But let me go back to and then talk about another underserved group, individuals with disabilities. So to that extent, one of the questions in which we asked during the course of the auditing efforts, how many contractors contact the Department of Employment and Economic Development to obtain names of referrals for people with disabilities? This question doesn't come out of the blue. That's actually a requirement under the Minnesota Administrative Rule. It's 5,035.57. So within our ask of questions and auditing contractors, we directed the contractors to do that. And one of the reasons why we did so, beyond it just simply being in the rule, we wanted to uplift the conversation as it relates to the resources which exist at the state level that can assist businesses in hiring people with disabilities. So again, for us, this is something trying to use creatively those tools that we have to ask to really ensure that people have great opportunities to seek careers and jobs. What does that then mean for you in the audience as it relates to those questions that we're asking? For the folks that are local human rights commissions, I would submit to you that what we found is that not enough businesses knew what was going on in their own backyard about hiring people with disabilities. They have some idea, right, that there might be some location. I don't know if people live there or they might be getting services. They have some vague idea. But they really don't know what great resources that you can help provide them with to create employment opportunities for people. So while we're having this conversation at 40,000, I would love for you to be having that conversation down on the ground within the local communities throughout the state of Minnesota, saying more about what you're doing to create opportunities for employment for people with disabilities. Because a nice thing that when we asked this question, employers were very interested and eager to learn more. So I'm teeing it up for you. We've primed it. They're interested. Now, if you can then close the deal for us and provide them with great information, I think we can make a significant impact on hiring more people with disabilities. In the auditing process here, this is what we're talking about, the 500 contractors with a workforce certificate. So if a business is doing work for the state of Minnesota and providing goods or services over $100,000, or everybody's favorite metropolitan agencies, the Metropolitan Sports Facility Authority, the Metropolitan Airports Commission, Metropolitan Council, and I guess this is everybody's favorite, right? The Metropolitan Mosquito Control. Right? That's when you know you're... So to that extent, if those entities are doing work, contracting, we make sure that they are providing opportunities for folks. Another one trying to tee this up for the folks in the local communities is an opportunity which I think is really being missed. So when we asked contractors, you're not required to, but if you do so, we want some information, and that is, do you have an internship or an apprenticeship program? So kudos, about 75% of the contractors actually had an internship or an apprenticeship program. That's great. Then we kicked the tires a little bit more and then asked them how much had they actually done besides just simply drafting that plan. And unfortunately, we found about a third of them actually hadn't taken any steps beyond just simply drafting the plan. And to the contractors in the audience, I'm not going to out you if you were on that list. Just making sure you're paying attention. So to that extent, again, I think this is a great opportunity for folks at the local level now that we're having this conversation up here, because I hear that folks are talking about Right Track. I hear people are talking about Step-Up program. I hear that people are talking about being very intentional with local community colleges. But there's a little bit of a disconnect. Maybe there's some fear, maybe there's some connection that you can help bridge as it relates to having people make that plan an actual reality. And again, for us, what we're also trying to do is nudge our agency partners, like DEED, like Office of Higher Education, like the Department of Education, to provide more information to businesses on how to be successful in implementing internship and apprenticeship type programs. And hopefully we can come into the middle and then we'll have more success. We do partner with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So again, I appreciate the folks from the EEOC that are in the room. Some of the earlier conversations today, uplifting pregnancy accommodations. For the folks that are in the room that are unaware of the change that happened under Women's Economic Security Act, let me take 1 second, give a little bit of a shout out as it relates to the great work in the Women's Economic Security Act. My wife has a sister that lives in Wisconsin. She would probably be mortified of this example that I'm going to give because I'm going to assume that she's pregnant, and believe me, she's done having kids just like my wife is done having kids. But let's just for this conversation here, assume both women are pregnant at this point in time. In the state of Wisconsin, if my sister-in-law, Kelly, decides that she wishes to get an accommodation, ask for a stool, or she decides that she doesn't feel comfortable lifting more than 20 pounds, under state and federal law, she would have to provide some information to be able to identify that she would meet the definition of being a disabled individual in order to get that accommodation. In the state of Minnesota, under the Women's Economic Security Act, there is no requirement for a woman to get such medical documentation to support being defined as an individual with disabilities. I think this is relatively amazing, really, in some of the climate that we have had as it relates to the state law being changed in that way. From a historical basis, there had been some conversation of whether the Pregnancy Discrimination Act should have been interpreted, should have been defined the way in which currently the Women's Economic Security Act is applied and has been enacted here in the state of Minnesota. We have been on the road talking about the difference on that provision of the Women's Economic Security Act, and then also the challenge as it relates to pregnant women in the workforce and the challenges that they have. Within the equal pay provisions, the statute now has been changed that not only are we taking a look at equal employment opportunity practices, but we're also examining whether women are paid fairly to men among those state contracts. Again, this is very different than what is existing in other states. And what we're finding is that women of color women overall get 80 cents on the dollar, and then somewhere between 52% or 52 cents to 74%, depending on your race and ethnicity and how you identify, is what you are then receiving if you're a woman. Surprisingly, there are people here that are inquisitive that I adjusted the goals for women in construction from 6% to 20%. Yeah, I saw a couple of you smile. So again, for background for individuals, in 2011, when I came on as commissioner, the actual participation for construction goals, what was being achieved by contractors, was about 3.6% for women and a little less than 11% for people of color in Hennepin and well, actually it was for the whole state, but in Hennepin and Ramsey, the volume of work was pretty close to what we were seeing across the state, so they were basically the same. For some of you, you may recall that in 2011 or 2012, Dr. Algernon Austin from the Economic Policy Institute had published a study and he identified the greatest disparities between unemployment for whites and African Americans throughout the country. And unfortunately, the Twin Cities landed #1 on that list, which is not where you want to land. And then for Latinos, which didn't get as much play, but I think it's important, we were #5 on that list. And then for Native Americans, Dr. Austin identified that he did not have enough data concerning the other 25 metropolitan areas to make that calculation, but he suggests in a footnote that Native Americans, we might have been #1 on that list as well. So significant employment disparities which were existing. Why do I give you that background? So 2012, we adjusted workforce goals to 32% in Hennepin and Ramsey, and then in Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Scott, and Washington, we adjusted the goals to 22%. I'll say people fell off their chairs a little bit, right? Because there was a sense that this is a significant jump from where the goal was at 11%. How could this be achieved? Stadium project roughly achieves 36%. People kind of understand that. That's a significant undertaking, the largest construction project. But other projects such as the St. Croix Lift Bridge, I see folks from MnDOT here in the room, the State Capitol Restoration Project, the Senate Office Building, other projects also achieved over 32%. The year after the stadium was completed, the average participation rate in Hennepin and Ramsey County was 28.5%. So again, I appreciate that this is not every construction project throughout the state, but if we're talking about the projects which we're monitoring going from 11% to 28.5% in 5 years, that's a significant undertaking which has been accomplished by the folks in construction. And even though I know sometimes they get a little anxious with me when I adjust the goals on them, I do want to thank them for all the hard work in which they have done, because they have made a difference in created careers and opportunities for people. Well, what does that then mean at the local level for individuals within the room? Let me go back to it. Again, the goals for the Department of Human Rights only attach to state projects and only attach to the 4 major agencies. And I know you're just thinking about the mosquito control, but it's a couple other agencies. But the goals don't attach if the state gives money to a county and then the county goes and builds something. Or if the state gives money to a city and then the city goes and creates something. Or even as it relates to funding for respective schools. And there's about more than $1 billion worth of construction currently underway on schools. So to that extent, if you're seeing economic challenges, if you're seeing unemployment disparities, this could be something, again, at the local level that you as local human rights commissioners, you could be advocating for to either your mayor or to county commissioners, and you can potentially have a significant impact on creating more economic opportunities within your local areas. The education piece, which we have tried to do more here in getting the word out as it relates to what is going on and ensuring that people understand how discrimination, disparate outcomes are negatively impacting them. So we've tried to do more with the Know Your Rights events, the Human Rights Symposium. I appreciate the folks that have been in the room that have been to our annual Human Rights Symposium in the past and that will be there at the City of St. Paul's River Center on December 12th and 13th. Shameless plug, yes. Well, we've also done more as it relates to publications, webinars. Again, I really appreciate Jeff's work, Kayla's work, Emily, Christine, outstanding work that they have done to sort of uplift and educate more people about what's going on so that they can make informed decisions to eliminate discrimination, disparate outcomes. We've tried to be much more intentional on the policy work in which we've done. And then we've been very fortunate to partner with TPT, and you can go to our website. We've done 3 documentaries between 26 and 29 minutes runtime, one taking a look from a historical perspective, one talking about workforce, and then one talking about the future. So some of you will see Dr. Josie Johnson, the First Lady of Civil Rights, talking about housing discrimination from 50 years ago. There'll be a little bit of a shout out as it relates to the Evelyn Mine case, which some of you know is the first time a federal district court certified a class action for women on a hostile environment. But you'll also see issues and challenges as it relates to people with disabilities. You'll see issues on police brutality. We even see Justice Anderson making some joke about how he doesn't want to give up privilege, especially since he's a good-looking guy. I'm believing you. All of those documentaries are on the website. Let me talk about executive orders. Again, these aren't statutory, but they are tied to sort of the work that we're trying to do within the education outreach effort. So we have Darlene Zangara, the Executive Director of the Olmstead initiative here, so I appreciate her being here. This is a holistic look. Olmstead refers to the Olmstead Supreme Court case, not our beloved Olmstead County. Yay! Rochester's in the house, all right. Tribal consultation policy, again, a partnership with 11 federally recognized tribes within the state of Minnesota. How do we partner with them to ensure that they are fully participating with the state of Minnesota as co-equal sovereigns? Ending homelessness subcabinet, the work there, a lot of good information which can be given to folks at the city and the county level, and we hope to facilitate more of those conversations with the executive director, Kathy Tenbrook. And I know that she has partnered with some of you within the audience, but always looking to try and do more within that space. Diversity and inclusion, I'll talk a little bit more about that here on the next slide. So with this, 2012, for some of you that might have been there, actually it was April 2011, I'm sorry, is that Governor Dayton went to the Urban League in North Minneapolis, open meeting, and after that meeting, about 8 days later, he talked about creating more space opportunities for people to have opportunities to become employed within state government, for contracting opportunities, and then also to hear and participate more in the public policy realm. Micah Hines, who was the current general counsel at that time, and myself, and then others within the governor's office, sat down and took a look at the prior executive orders which governors had signed. And what we had found is that most had signed an executive order which was very narrow, and it was generally titled affirmative action. And this is actually teeing up the conversation later as it relates to diversity and inclusion councils. So what we suggested to the governor is to say, you really should look at this as it relates to how business would look at it. And from this business perspective, they wouldn't do the narrowest, the minimalist that they would have to do from compliance from a regulation standpoint. They would seek to really truly become sort of a model employer of choice. They would seek to become a supplier of choice. They would seek to brand in a way that people would come to them. So if you're really thinking about companies that are on the outer edge, the sort of brand awareness and people wanting to find out more, well, government doesn't sell products, but it does engage in public policy. And wouldn't it be great if a government was in a space in which you really had all of its citizens wanting to participate in public policy? Wanting to participate in conversations? So again, I go back a pitch here to the local human rights commissions. I think this is a great space for you to play in. There's too many examples probably, right, for all of us in this room of where people are shouting at one another and people aren't talking. And sometimes it feels as if government is not listening. Can you play a role in restoring, instilling, providing opportunity and space for folks to have conversations? And I think for the governor, when he signed the Diversity and Inclusion Council, he created a civic engagement aspect, which is the very first time that such an effort had ever been incorporated within an executive order by a governor. Nick Core, who is in the room, Nick, if you want to raise your hand, he is going to be leading a conversation on his efforts to ensure that government at the state level is very intentional in having what we consider meaningful reciprocal conversations. Some ways I could describe it in this: everybody has a significant other. If that significant other decides when they're going to pick you up, when you're going to go out to eat, what you're going to eat, they order for you, when you're going to go to the movie, what time you're going to come back from the movie, and they continue to do that, that's probably not a relationship you're going to be in, right? Right. So to that extent, how often is it that, unfortunately, that government is in kind of those kind of dynamics? It's dictating the terms of when the conversation is going to be had, narrowing the scope of the conversation. You're not really sure how your input is actually going to be used. So really kudos to the great work that Nick, and it's not just Nick, because there are agencies that really have been thinking about how to really do civic engagement better. So Nick is sort of grabbing on hold on all of that great energy and making sure that when we're ready to pass the baton to the next governor, that we've really instilled the best practices that we can as it relates to how to have more of a reciprocal conversation dynamic. And to that extent, I'm really hoping that you at the local level are going to be able to help us in that way. Because we also know that state can't always answer all of these problems. It's going to really require cities, counties, states, federal government, all of us working together. Quick comment on a couple of statutory references. This first one here is ban the box. This was passed in 2013. This doesn't mandate that employers have to hire individuals with a criminal record, but it does put a stop sign that they should review information about that candidate, and if they are deciding that they want to interview that candidate, proceed with the interview with that candidate, and at that point in time, then take a look at the criminal history information. So 1 in 4 individuals in the United States today, I could pull up some information which would be negative from a criminal background standpoint. We've been partnering with Emily Baxter with We Are All Criminals. There's going to be a kickoff for her book on the 11th. If you're interested or have followed her, it's a great opportunity to find more. But in essence, what We Are All Criminals says is, there but for the grace of God go I. How many of us, as my grandfather used to say, when you're 18 and going out on a Friday night, don't do some dumb knuckle-headed things? How many of us may have done some dumb knuckle-headed things that we're just really glad that we did not get caught for? Right. I appreciate the honesty. So to that extent, what we're really trying to do is to say, look, there are some people that are no really different than us. How do we give them a real opportunity to get a job, to become educated, to secure housing? Let's not let one mistake in the past be a stumbling block that prevents them from going forward in the future. Emerging Entrepreneur Program, this was added in 2015. Again, the department's sitting on a board with DEED and the Metropolitan Council seeking to create opportunities for emerging entrepreneurs to grow businesses. Most people probably would not think of the Department of Human Rights as a vehicle to facilitate conversation this way. But please do think of us in this way of partnering with DEED and with others to create opportunities for businesses. School bullying. Again, the school bullying law, Commissioner Casillas and I serve as co-chairs on the School Safety Technical Assistance Council. It directs that all school districts should have a model school bullying policy and that they should faithfully adhere to that policy. We are seeking to ensure that that happens consistently throughout with all school districts. Some of you might have seen on the news, either locally or nationally, that there was a toolkit which was issued by the School Safety Technical Assistance Council concerning transgender and non-gender conforming students. So just for clarity, if that conversation does happen in your local area within the state, a toolkit that gets announced by such an agency as ours through this effort is guidance. It's not a dictate, okay? So school districts, they can take all of the great ideas within the toolkit, or they can choose not to use the ideas within the toolkit. There are some provisions within the toolkit I will share with you, which we are very clear as it relates to where the law is. So to those provisions within the toolkit, as long as you are consistent with those levels within the law, school districts are free to do what they wish to do on that respective issue. And with that, I think I have about 5-10 minutes maybe for questions.
When talking about persons with disabilities and workforce participation, is that typically self-identification or self-declaration, or do individuals need to document that they have a disability in order to receive those protections and oversight?
The way you've asked the question, I'm wondering, are you talking about when we are doing the auditing, or are you talking about the way in which we're doing investigation?
Auditing, and just when we're talking about workforce participation goals for persons with disabilities. So with persons of color, people self-identify with disabilities, there are, legal definitions and social security definitions of what counts as a disability. Do people have to show that, or can they self-identify as having a disability?
No, it's a great question. So within the space as relates to contractors, they will have developed an affirmative action plan, and they will identify what we refer to internally as underutilization. So they will say that there are some opportunities which exist for individuals with disabilities in widget making or being in this class of jobs. And they will identify a plan to address that. And then we'll look to see how well that they have implemented their plan to hire more individuals with disabilities. So I was asked this question like in Duluth a couple of weeks ago, in which someone was saying that they were scared to be able to ask for data to identify people either by race or by disability. So I want to make sure that I'm clear on this, and that I do think there is a challenge out there as relates to people being concerned and not wishing to identify themselves as an individual with disability. And I think that there's probably underreporting, and there's probably more that we can do to educate employers that they can ask for that information at certain points in time, and that's okay for them to ask for that information. Is that helpful? Yep, okay. Other questions?
Thank you for having us here today, Commissioner. My name is Fred Ventura. I'm from the great city of Olmstead, and I have a pretty basic question. In Olmstead, we have an LED billboard that's 60 feet in the air, and we put diversity messages up there. The most recent one we have up there is called Teach Peace, and it shows two people shaking hands. The question I have that citizens come to me is, how do you teach peace? And sometimes I get baffled and try to come back with a good answer.
I'm waiting for the easy one. No, I think that's a great question. I don't think that it's very easy. I think that we are in a midst as relates to what are fundamental values, which are really important. And one of the fundamental values, which I would have said for me was very clear as a young person, was that there is tremendous value in being able to have peaceful debate and conversation to come to solutions which divide us. I'm not sure that's a shared value by all of us anymore. So I think that there's probably need to have some intentional conversations. I think there needs to be an intentional partnership to say that that is truly important and of value. And I think that is sometimes, as Winston Churchill said, is that sometimes the Americans, the greatest democracy in the world, and they do great things. Problem is sometimes they try everything before they get to that point. So I think, unfortunately, we may be in a space in which yelling and shouting at each other on talk radio and other places is what we're trying. But I think we understand that at the end of the day, that we only really move forward in a democracy such as ours if we're really willing to have peaceful conversation and debate with one another.
I'm with the local community also, and I've been working in healthcare for 40 years as a manager and have 150 direct reports. I often have people apply with a disability or a no background. In home care, I had a nurse aide that took money out of an elder's, it was like quarters. And so she was banned from ever working there again. And she was about 18. I had another nurse after 20 years. She had thrown a coffee mug at her boyfriend 20 years ago in an argument, banned for 10 years from ever working there. And then jobs continued to turn her down for work over time. How do you, and I'm the person who's arguing till I'm blue in the face. I had a nurse who couldn't hear. HR said, no, it's too much liability to hire people in wheelchairs and people with disabilities because they might not hear the alarm of the patient. How do you work with those companies? Are you hiring those people? And HR is really, and even the State Board of Nursing is there anything we can do to advocate for those people?
So did everyone in the back hear the question? No? Okay. I'm going to try and summarize it, then I'll answer the question. So a person in HR has asked me a question concerning some of the challenges of being able to hire somebody who has a criminal background history. And sometimes those incidents happened 15 to 20 years ago, and they were not what the HR professional would consider high-level crimes or crimes which would give her great concern for hiring the individual. Now, within this space, there are some challenges because there are some regulatory agencies which may limit the ability of the employer to be able to hire someone. Is that fair?
Yes, I'm a manager though.
Okay.
HR that I'm having the arguments with.
All right. So to that extent, there's a couple of things here that people should be aware of. So I believe the statute's 245 or 256, but it's one of the two as relates to healthcare entities within the state of Minnesota, which basically says the Commissioner of Human Services does a background study check for that individual. So the individual goes through that process, and if they get cleared by the Commissioner of Human Services, they're then eligible to be employed. So let me make just a quick point here. It's actually not the employer excluding at the first level, right? So sometimes employers are making that determination before actually asking whether the commissioner has a concern or not. So let's assume, for purposes here, that the commissioner is okay with the person working within the field. And in that situation, then I think it's really incumbent upon the employer to say the length of time, the severity of the crime, what the person has done in the past. And again, if you are not aware of it, if you've not seen it, on April 25th, 2012, the EEOC published guidance concerning how employers may wish to consider criminal background history information in making a determination on whether to hire someone. I would encourage you, if you have not read it, to read it and take into account the factors and analysis that the EEOC does in that time. My sense is that we would move to a space beyond ban the box to where we get to a point of a crime that's happened over a certain period of time should not be considered by an employer. Being what I know of the legislature and how well or not well the legislature and the governor are getting along, that may be a little challenging this session. But I do hear from employers a willingness to say, could we have a brighter line as it relates to when we'll take into consideration criminal history information. 6 years ago when we were debating ban the box, I didn't hear that conversation among employers. So maybe we get to a point of saying anything after 10 years we don't take into consideration unless it might be, first-degree murder with intent or something like that. I could see the law developing that way.
Thank you.
My name is Abdul Yusuf, so I am the volunteer for
Can you come up to the microphone? Oh, the microphone's here. And I apologize. I didn't see the microphone earlier.
My name is Abdul Yusuf, so I am the volunteer of Amnesty International. I say thank you very much for the Minnesota Human Rights and 50 years anniversary. And actually, and thank you for your training for all people in Minnesota. I appreciate that. Educate the people, that is the best. My question is today, and how long is it going to be taken to change for the people when they are in line waiting at the cashier to such kind of like disability people? Absolutely, Minnesota, they doing a great job, absolutely, but still we need to change something. Because the cashiers, when they're waiting long, and there's a lot of people around, there is no line, priority line for the disability people. Because disability people, some people they are disability and they are sick also. They have such kind of like blood pressures, diabetes, whatever they have, the other people have. But they can't wait the line so long. We must have to another line, a special line, priority line, to help those disability people. That's my suggestion, how long it's going to be take for Minnesota and Department of Human Rights to take that action. Thank you very much, Minnesota Human Rights. Thanks.
So thanks. A couple of things. What I hear within that is sort of the fierce urgency of now, right? So Dr. King articulated as relates to how long. So in the March on Washington, African Americans have been given an insufficient check, and unemployment at that point in time was in the mid-30s. So to that extent, why hasn't it taken so long, given that slavery ended, more than 100 years prior to him making that speech? I wish I had a good answer to that relates to why are we locked into this debate when we see disparities. I don't really have a great answer as relates to it, because I do see, as Dr. King has articulated before, our destinies being intertwined. It is clearly that point in time where it should be self-evident to everyone. Let me give you one other factoid about that intertwined nature. So when we adjust to the workforce goals, there were 5.9 million people in the United States that were over the age of 85. In 15 years, that number will be 19.6 million. Most of those individuals will identify as white, not of Hispanic origin. So to this extent, as it relates to people thinking that somehow their destiny is not going to be tied along racial lines, believe me, that's not going to be the case, right? Now, when people all see that, that's a different question. I'm hopeful that conversations like we're having today, I'm hopeful that the conversations that you're going to be having, I'm hopeful that the conversations which are going to go forward by the folks in your sphere of influence are going to speed that up, and we'll get to a better point. What I also heard within this question was sort of challenges as relates to healthcare benefits. So again, CHIPS was a program at the federal level, which the Congress has made the determination this week not to fund. So that's a significant impact, not just to Minnesota, but what I would consider across the nation, to individuals with disabilities and individuals of limited income. Again, to that extent, if you're talking about sustaining yourself, a measure of a great state, a great country, as even Humphrey would say, is how well you take care of children. And I think we're having that conversation of whether we really truly wish to be a great state, country, and take care of children going forward. Are there any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, I have a question, comment. My name is Lau Gang, and my issue is, I know that in today's society, race has never been more, the issue of race has never been more prevalent. And I'm wondering, does the State Human Rights Commission have any campaigns on how to address this, to work with law enforcement agencies or local activist groups to address this, or maybe put a plan out there for everybody to look at?
So did everyone hear the question in the back? No? Yes? No? So I'll rephrase the question. Does the Department of Human Rights have the Marshall Plan as it relates to how the state should talk about race and how we should move forward together? Welcome to the beginning of the Marshall Plan development. So we have had conversations with individuals within foundations about how to coordinate and strategize about having such a conversation. No definitive plan has come out of that, but good conversations have started. Part of that conversations at that level was making sure that we took in the input, good ideas at the local level. So I had said to some of the leaders of those various foundations, we're going to have this event with local human rights commissions. We're going to talk about Diversity and Inclusion Council, and hopefully we'll hear some great ideas from them from a local level as to what's going on and seeing what momentum can be created there. So I don't want to say that nothing is happening, but I also want to be clear that as Scott, my legislative liaison, says, is that we get was it 1/5,000th? 1/5,000th of the state's budget. So we are, are we even the tail, or are we just the flea on the tail of the dog? So I also want to be cognizant of that as well. Are there other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. I'm one of those disabled people after having a long professional life, traumatic brain injuries. And I worked with high school students for many years. Why aren't any of you even talking to the student councils in the high schools?
So the question is,
I was able to get the new voting machines that came in about 25 years ago into St. Paul Central. So the students there voted for their class representatives and such and such. And they know what they're doing. They're so good on the computerized systems now and the internet that why aren't you approaching them? I've been disabled out of life for 24 years. And this is still the same thing going on because we were doing a great job out there and no one is paying attention to them. You could get people in those school buildings because we have taxis driving all around the city all the time. Pick up 2 people in some location and they're going to probably have lunch at school, volunteers in those buildings. And you're probably going to need National Guard pretty soon if you're not careful. And Governor Dayton, I noticed that when I kind of became better to hear and read and see again. I noticed what he's doing, especially for little children. So you have to do this. And if you don't, you're losing all of it. They're the ones graduating and going into the workforce or into life. Most of them don't go to liberal arts colleges, so they won't learn 90% of what we hope and need them to know. The Marshall Plan, great idea. All the judges in this country who are helping with the oath to become a citizen, write to them. Have the student council of those high schools do that. Thank you.
so thank you for that comment and questions. So there's 2 pieces I think that I heard within that. The first piece that I heard in there, that there should be intentionality and an overarching sort of comprehensive effort to get within schools into educational settings to prepare people for internships, apprenticeship opportunities, for career opportunities. So I'll talk about that writ large broadly. So some of the things which the department has done when we're talking about auditing contractors, we're trying to use our ability through those administrative rules to encourage the development. So we're trying to give a pat on the back to the companies that are trying to be intentional, but then we're also meeting with Department of Education, Office of Higher Education, MNSCU, to say where we see linkages and where it's working, and then also providing them with some information on how they can improve within that space. So there's a very intentional sort of regulatory piece that we do within auditing. I didn't talk about it here yet, but I'll say it now, is that we partnered and worked with and supported an effort, and I'll use construction just for now, Construct for Tomorrow. So that came out of conversations of saying we need more support to get within high schools, to be on the front end, to be working with school children, and to expose them to careers within construction. Several individuals from the construction trades, several individuals from the Department of Education, some individuals from MNSCU. I remember sitting in Commissioner Casilius' office about 5 years ago. And from there, and meeting with Krista Seberg, the Construct for Tomorrow, that program grew from not having been in any schools to now being in about 15 schools. In each of the school, I should really say areas where they go to, they bus kids actually from several schools into locations, and anywhere between 500 and 850 people come to these respective events. So here in St. Paul at the Jimmy Lee Recreation Center, probably about 12, 14 months ago, all the St. Paul public schools and then some of the Minneapolis public schools came to that location. So to that extent, that is happening. I also heard, I think, as it relates to working with people with disabilities, there isn't an equivalent as it relates to Construct for Tomorrow, but that's not to say that we haven't been in conversation about how to expand and do things of that nature. And when we've had an opportunity to be at the State Council on Disabilities annual event on talking about strategies, that's one that we always put forward and try to move and to do more within respective schools. I think that I'm out of time. Is there any other questions? The governor always says, don't stand between people and food, otherwise you get run over. So with that, I want to thank you very much for the questions that you have. I'm thankful that you are here today, and I am encouraged that we're going to do some great things and move the debate and conversation forward. So thank you.